My name is Martin, and the morning everything started, I was only looking for a phone charger. That's the part nobody believes when I tell this now, that the worst chapter of my life began over something so small. I'm Martin Holt, 41, a structural engineer who'd spent 2 decades making sure other people's buildings didn't fall down. I had never once thought I'd need to run the same kind of inspection on my own marriage. Renata's bag was open on the kitchen counter. I reached in without thinking, the way you do after 12 years, when reaching into your wife's bag isn't even a decision anymore, just muscle memory built on trust. I found a charger. I also found a second phone. Not hers. Smaller, older, the kind you buy with cash and never register to your name. I stood there holding it while the coffee maker hissed behind me, and Maya's school bus rattled past the window, and for about 4 seconds I told myself it was probably a work phone. Renata managed a regional sales team. Companies issued burner-looking devices for trade conferences sometimes. That was the story I built in those 4 seconds, brick by brick, because it was easier to live in than the alternative. I put it back exactly where I found it. I didn't turn it on. I told myself that not looking was a kind of integrity. It wasn't. It was the first of many times I'd choose not knowing over knowing, because knowing would cost more than I was ready to pay. We'd been married 12 years by then. Renata and I met at a wedding. Not our own, obviously, a cousin's, back when she was 26 and worked sales for a medical device company and laughed with her whole body, head back, like the joke had physically knocked something loose in her. I was an awkward 30-year-old in a rented suit who couldn't dance, and she pulled me onto the floor anyway and said, "You're going to embarrass yourself either way, might as well do it with me." I married that sentence as much as I married her. We had Maya 2 years in, Eli 4 years after that. We bought a house in Cedar Hollow with a crooked oak tree in the backyard that Maya named Steve for reasons no one ever explained. I built decks. I coached Eli's t-ball team badly. Renata climbed the ladder at her company, regional manager by year 8, talk of director by year 10, and somewhere in there, without either of us marking the date, the woman who used to pull me onto dance floors started coming home later, sitting in her car in the driveway for 10 minutes before walking in, scrolling through something on her phone with her thumb moving fast and her face doing nothing at all. I noticed. I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story about a man who was blindsided with no warning. I noticed, and I let it go, because that's what I do. That's the thing about me you need to understand before anything else. I am a patient man, and patience, somewhere along the way, became the polite word I used for not wanting to deal with hard conversations. If something felt wrong, I waited for it to resolve itself. If Renata seemed distant, I told myself she was tired. If she seemed irritated by a question, I stopped asking it. I had spent years being good at the wrong things, at keeping the peace, at not asking, at making everything look fine from the outside. And somewhere in there I'd stopped noticing that fine had become a performance we were both putting on for an audience of nobody. That morning with the phone, I went to work. I sat through a client call about load-bearing calculations for a parking structure in Grand Rapids, and I don't remember a single word of it. I remember the weight of that phone in my hand. I remember telling myself it was nothing, and somewhere underneath that, in a part of me I wasn't ready to listen to yet, I remember already knowing it wasn't. That night, Renata came home at 7:40, later than usual, wearing the kind of brightness that, looking back now, I recognize as a mask people wear when they're worried they've left a thread hanging somewhere. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about Eli's day, made a joke about Maya's science project. Everything textbook. Everything fine. I almost asked her about the phone. I had this sentence built. "Hey, found a phone in your bag this morning. What's that about?" Sitting right there behind my teeth. And then Eli ran in wanting help with a puzzle, and the moment closed like a door, and I let it close, and told myself there'd be a better time. There's a thing I understand now that I didn't understand then. There is never a better time. There is only the time you choose, and the time you don't, and every time you don't is a vote for staying exactly where you are. Over the next 6 weeks, the signs accumulated the way snow does. One flake doesn't mean anything, and then one day you look up and there's 2 feet of it, and you can't remember when it started sticking. Renata started a new girls' trivia night, on Thursdays that I'd never heard mentioned before. She began locking her phone with a passcode, something she'd never bothered with in 12 years. She started running again. Actual running, 3 miles most mornings, a new gym membership, a new interest in what she ate. None of it was damning on its own. People start running. People make new friends. I told myself that, over and over, like a man repeating a phrase in a language he doesn't quite believe. What I didn't tell myself, because I genuinely hadn't put it together yet, was that all these new things were happening on the same general timeline, clustering around the same 8-week window, like separate pieces of a single event I hadn't yet been allowed to see. Looking back now, that was the moment I should have asked the question I kept avoiding. I called it a busy season for her career then. I wouldn't call it that anymore. The first real crack came on a Tuesday in March, when I picked Eli up early from school because he'd thrown up at recess, and I called Renata's office to let her know I had it covered. No need for her to leave work. The receptionist, a woman named Carla I'd met at 2 holiday parties, paused in a way that snagged something in my chest and said, "Oh, she's actually out of office today, hon. Has been since this morning. Conference call from home, I think." Renata was not at home. I knew because I'd just come from home, packing Eli's overnight bag in case the fever spiked, and the house had been empty, her car gone. I didn't say anything to Carla. I said, "Oh, right, my mistake," in a voice that came out steadier than I felt, and I hung up, and I sat in the school parking lot with Eli buckled in the back seat asking if we could get a milkshake, and something tightened in my chest that I couldn't name yet, but I felt it land somewhere and stay there. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever sat in a parking lot holding a small, ordinary lie in your hands, turning it over, trying to find an explanation that doesn't end where you already know it's going to end, you know exactly what that felt like. Not rage yet, not even real fear, just a low, cold hum, like a refrigerator you only notice once the kitchen goes quiet. I didn't confront her that night. I told myself I needed more than one strange phone call from a receptionist who might have simply misspoken. I told myself a lot of things that spring. What I was actually doing, though I couldn't have named it then, was buying time to not have to act, because as long as I didn't have proof, I didn't have to do anything. And as long as I didn't have to do anything, my life could keep looking exactly the way it had always looked. That's the part of myself I'm least proud of in this whole story. Not that I was deceived. Anyone can be deceived by someone who's decided to deceive them well. What I'm less proud of is how long I let myself stay comfortable inside the deception once I had real reason to doubt it. I didn't ask. Not because I didn't want to know, but because I was afraid of the answer and afraid of what asking would force me to do about it. Maya turned 9 that April. We threw her a backyard party. Steve the oak tree got streamers. Eli insisted on a piñata shaped like a dinosaur. And for one entire Saturday afternoon, watching Renata laugh with the other mothers, refilling lemonade, kneeling down to take a photo of Maya blowing out candles, I let myself believe the cold hum in my chest had been wrong. I let myself believe we were fine. I have a photograph from that day. Renata's hand on my shoulder, both of us looking at our daughter. And I kept it on my desk for a long time afterward, not because I missed the moment, but because I needed to study it, later, to understand how someone can stand inside a lie and still let their hand rest, warm and ordinary, on your shoulder. That night, after the kids were down, Renata sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where, 18 months later, a different conversation would end everything. And she said, out of nowhere, "Do you ever feel like you disappeared somewhere along the way? Like you used to be a whole person and now you're just Maya's dad, Eli's dad, the guy who fixes the gutters?" I should have heard that for what it was, not idle musing, but a confession dressed as a question, a woman testing whether the floor beneath her marriage could hold the weight of an honest conversation. Instead, I laughed, a little, and said something about how parenthood does that to everybody, and asked if she wanted more wine. She looked at me for a second longer than the moment required. I remember that look. I think about it more than almost anything else from that year. And then she said, "Yeah, sure." And the subject closed, and I let it close, the way I let everything close. I understand now that denial isn't weakness. It's a decision. You choose it because the alternative costs more than you think you can afford to pay. I chose it that night, at that table, with my daughter's birthday streamers still hanging in the dark yard outside the window. By May, the suspicion had stopped being something I could outrun. The Thursday trivia nights had become twice a week. She'd bought new underwear I never saw her wear at home. Once, reaching for her phone to silence an alarm while she was in the shower, I saw a notification flash across the lock screen, a name I didn't recognize. No message preview, just a name, Carter. The screen went dark before I could think twice. I stood there in our bedroom holding nothing, having seen everything, and the cold hum in my chest turned, for the first time, into something with a shape. I didn't say his name out loud that day. I wrote it down instead, not on paper, just in my head, where I'd carry it for the next 11 weeks like a stone in my pocket, taking it out sometimes when I was alone in the car, turning it over, putting it back. That's where I'll leave this part of the story. Not with a confrontation, not yet, but with a man standing in his own bedroom, 12 years into a marriage he thought he understood, holding a name he didn't recognize and a silence he didn't yet know how to break. I had no proof. I had no plan. What I had was a small, sharp certainty settling into my chest like a splinter too deep to dig out with my fingers. The knowledge, not yet spoken, that something had already changed, and that I was the last person in the house who hadn't admitted it yet. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from performing normalcy while your insides are quietly rearranging themselves, and that spring, I became fluent in it. Mornings still looked the way mornings had always looked. I made coffee. Renata packed lunches with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. Turkey sandwich for Maya, no crust. Some butter for Eli, who developed a peanut allergy at for that still terrified me every time I read a label. We argued lightly about whose turn it was to drive carpool. We were, by any outside measure, a functioning family. Inside that functioning family, I had started keeping a private ledger. Not on paper. I wasn't ready for paper yet. Paper made it real in a way I wasn't prepared to face. But in my head, a quiet accounting of inconsistencies I filed away and didn't examine too closely, the way you might notice a crack in a foundation and tell yourself you'll get to it eventually. Knowing eventually is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The name Carter surfaced twice more that month. Once on her phone screen again, this time with a message preview I caught half of before it vanished. Can't tonight. M has a thing. And once, more strangely, from Maya, who mentioned over dinner that Mommy's work friend had picked her up from a friend's birthday party because Renata's meeting ran long. What work friend? I asked, keeping my voice light, reaching for the salad bowl like the question weighed nothing at all. Carter, Maya said, around a mouthful of rice. He's nice. He has a dog. Renata's hand, reaching for the water pitcher, paused for exactly half a second before continuing its motion, smooth as if nothing had happened. He's from the regional office, she said, not looking at me. Helped me out when my meeting ran over. I told you about it. She hadn't. I knew she hadn't. The way you know the difference between a memory and the absence of one. But I let it pass, because Eli started talking about the dog, and the conversation moved on without me, and I sat there chewing food I couldn't taste, doing the thing I now recognize as the central failure of that whole year. Choosing the path that required nothing of me, over and over, until the debt of all those small avoidances came due at once. I didn't ask. I smiled, even though inside I wanted to ask 100 questions, and I told myself that confronting her over a name our 9-year-old mentioned at dinner was paranoid, was beneath me, was the kind of thing insecure husbands did in movies. I had built, over 12 years, an identity as the calm one, the steady one, the man who didn't make scenes, and I discovered that spring that an identity like that can become its own kind of trap. I wasn't protecting Renata by staying quiet. I was protecting the version of myself I'd always told people I was. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever stood in a kitchen holding a question that could change everything and chosen the salad bowl instead, you already understand more about this story than I did at the time. The behavioral signs kept arriving, small and deniable, the way water finds cracks you didn't know existed. Renata started taking her phone into the bathroom when she showered, propping it on the sink where she could see the screen through the glass. She began answering texts with her thumb curled protectively over the keyboard, angling the phone away from me on the couch in a gesture so automatic she probably didn't notice herself doing it. Her gym bag, which used to live carelessly by the back door, started living in the trunk of her car. None of these things, alone, meant anything. I told myself that constantly, like a prayer. Lots of people guard their privacy. Lots of people get serious about fitness in their late 30s. I built an entire architecture of innocent explanations, each one structurally sound on its own, and I refused to step back far enough to see that together, they formed the unmistakable shape of a woman managing 2 separate lives. In June, something shifted that I didn't understand until much later. Renata came home one evening, a Thursday trivia night, ostensibly. And instead of the bright, slightly performed energy she usually carried in the door, she seemed hollowed out. Quiet through dinner. She went to bed early, claiming a headache, and I found her an hour later sitting on the edge of our bed in the dark, not crying exactly, just staring at her hands like she was trying to remember what they'd done. "You okay?" I asked, and meant it, despite everything. "Just tired," she said. "Long week." I sat down next to her. I almost asked the real question then. I had it loaded, the way I'd had it loaded a dozen times before, and instead I put my hand on her back and said, "You work too hard." And she leaned into me for a moment, just a moment, in a way that felt less like affection and more like someone setting down a weight they couldn't carry alone for one more second. Then she straightened, said she was fine, and the moment passed. I didn't know it then. She told me much later, in a different conversation entirely, what that night had actually been. I almost told him that night. I had the words sitting right there. "I need to tell you something. I've done something I can't undo." And I got as far as opening my mouth before I saw his face, still so unsuspecting, still looking at me like I was exactly who he thought I was. And I thought, if I say this, I lose all of it. The kids asleep down the hall. The house. The life I built even while I was breaking it. So I said I was tired instead. I told myself it was the last time. I told myself that for 3 weeks already, and every time I believed it a little less. But that night, I believed it enough to stay quiet. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. I only knew that something had passed across her face that night that I couldn't name, and that I'd chosen, again, not to ask. By July, the signs had escalated past what I could comfortably explain away, even to myself. She started a habit of stepping outside to take calls, work calls, always delivered in a tone that dared me to question it. Once, through the kitchen window, I watched her pace the length of the driveway, one arm wrapped around herself, voice too low to carry, and something about her posture, defensive, folded inward, told me this wasn't a conversation about quarterly sales targets. I also noticed, though I didn't understand its significance until much later, that she'd started being unusually, almost performatively attentive to the kids that month. Extra bedtime stories, a spontaneous trip to the splash pad, a homemade dinner on a random Tuesday for no occasion at all. I remember thinking, gratefully, that we were turning a corner. I didn't yet understand that guilt, in some people, doesn't look like withdrawal. It looks like overcompensation, like a woman trying to prove to herself, through her children, that she was still good, still whole, still the person she used to believe herself to be. The financial piece, the part of this story that would eventually matter as much as the affair itself, started small enough that I nearly missed it entirely. A credit card statement in August showed a charge from a hotel in Ann Arbor, 90 minutes from Cedar Hollow, dated a Thursday. Trivia night. I stared at that line item for a long time, the way you stare at an X-ray looking for the fracture you already suspect is there. I didn't say anything. I photographed the statement with my phone, the first concrete thing I'd done, the first small act that wasn't avoidance, and I told myself I was just being careful, just keeping records, not accusing anyone of anything. That was, I think now, the moment something shifted in me, even if I couldn't feel it shifting at the time. I hadn't decided to act yet, but I'd stopped only watching. I'd started, quietly, to build a case. And a part of me, the engineer in me, the part that spent his whole career trusting nothing until he'd verified the load-bearing math himself, had finally woken up. I called my older brother, Russell, that weekend, not to tell him everything. I wasn't ready for that, but to ask, in the careful, sideways way men sometimes ask each other things that matter, whether he thought I was being paranoid. Russell, who'd been divorced once and remarried once, listened to the abbreviated version, the second phone, the name, the hotel charge, and didn't say much for a long moment. "You already know," he said finally. "You're not calling me to find out if it's true. You're calling me because you need someone else to say it out loud first." I didn't argue with him. I think that's the closest I came, that whole summer, to admitting the truth to anyone, including myself. By the end of August, I had a folder, actually digital now, not just in my head, containing 3 credit card statements, 2 screenshots of unexplained calendar entries marked only with initials, and a growing, sick certainty I still hadn't spoken aloud to a single living person except, obliquely, my brother. Renata, meanwhile, had started sleeping with her back to me most nights. A small physical detail I noticed and filed away without yet understanding what it meant. That some part of her body had already left the marriage, weeks before the rest of her would. That detail seemed insignificant at the time. It wasn't. I want to pause here, because this is the part of the story where I have to be honest about something uncomfortable. Even with everything accumulating in that folder, even with the cold certainty sitting permanently in my chest now, instead of flickering in and out, I still hadn't said a word to her. I told myself I was being methodical. I told myself I wanted proof before I made an accusation I couldn't take back. Both of those things were true, but underneath them was something simpler and less flattering. I was afraid. Not of being wrong, of being right, and having to do something about it. The summer ended with Maya starting 4th grade and Eli starting 1st, with the particular chaos of new backpacks and first-day photographs in front of Steve the oak tree. And through all of it, Renata smiled in the photographs like a woman with nothing to hide, and I smiled back like a man who hadn't started quietly building the case that would eventually end his marriage. That's the part one still find hardest to forgive myself for. Not that I didn't know sooner. That once I did know, really know, in the part of me that doesn't lie to itself, I still spent another 2 months pretending, for the sake of 2 children who deserved better than a house full of unspoken truths, that everything was fine. September brought the kind of clarity that doesn't arrive all at once but accumulates like sediment, until one day you look down and realize the ground beneath you has entirely changed composition. I'd started, without fully admitting it to myself, doing something closer to surveillance than I was comfortable calling it. Not hacking anything. I didn't have her passwords, didn't try to get them, but paying closer attention than I ever had before. I noted when her phone buzzed and she glanced at it and didn't react, versus when she glanced at it and her whole posture changed for half a second before she smoothed it over. I noted the days she came home smelling faintly of a cologne that wasn't mine and the days she didn't. I noted that Carter from the regional office had, according to her own account, helped her with 3 separate things in 6 weeks: a flat tire, a forgotten conference badge, a ride when her car was in the shop. Each story delivered with the same slightly too quick fluency of something rehearsed. I didn't confront her. I gathered. There's a moral weight to that I still sit with sometimes. The idea that I spent 2 months essentially investigating my own wife instead of simply asking her a direct question. I've turned it over many times since, trying to decide if it was cowardice or self-preservation or some tangled combination of both. I think now it was this. Some part of me understood that the moment I asked the question out loud, I could never unask it. Whatever answer came back, true or false, would become the permanent shape of my marriage from that point forward. As long as I hadn't asked, I still technically lived in a house where nothing was confirmed. The not knowing, as miserable as it was, still had a door in it I could close. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever stood in a room full of people, a school fundraiser, a family barbecue, your own kitchen, and still felt completely, totally alone, even surrounded, even smiling, you know exactly what that fall felt like for me. I went to Eli's soccer games. I sat next to Renata on cold metal bleachers, our shoulders nearly touching, and felt a distance between us wider than anything physical could explain. I held her hand once, walking back to the car, and felt her fingers respond automatically, correctly, with absolutely nothing behind them. And that absence told me more than any hotel receipt ever could. The first real break came on the last Thursday of September. Renata left for trivia at 6:45, as usual. I told her I'd handle the kids' bedtime, as usual. And then, 40 minutes later, instead of sitting on the couch pretending to watch television while my stomach turned slowly over on itself, I called my mother to come sit with Maya and Eli, telling her only that I needed to run an errand. And I drove to the Marriott off Route 127 in Ann Arbor, the same hotel chain that had appeared 3 times now on statements I'd quietly photographed and filed away. I sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes, engine off, watching the entrance like a man auditioning for a role he never wanted. I told myself I'd give it until 8. At 7:52, I saw her car. A silver Audi pulled in 2 spaces down from where I was parked. Not hers, a man's car, the kind of detail you absorb without deciding to, and a man got out. Mid-40s, athletic in the deliberate way of someone who works at it, dressed in the kind of casual, expensive clothes that whisper rather than announce. He waited by the entrance, checking his phone, and 3 minutes later, Renata's car turned into the lot. I watched my wife get out of her car wearing a dress I didn't recognize, her hair down in a way she rarely wore it for trivia night, and walk toward that man with an ease, a familiarity, a particular quality of unguarded happiness I hadn't seen directed at me in longer than I wanted to admit. He said something. She laughed, the real laugh, the head-back laugh I remembered from a wedding 12 years earlier, the laugh I'd fallen in love with and hadn't heard in I didn't know how long. They went inside together. I didn't follow them in. I sat in my car in that parking lot for another 20 minutes, and something happened inside me that I still struggle to describe accurately, even now. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was closer to grief, a specific, suffocating grief for the version of my marriage I'd been quietly mourning for months without admitting it was already gone. I realized I hadn't been building a life with someone. For longer than I wanted to know, I'd been maintaining the appearance of one and telling myself that was the same thing. I drove home. I paid my mother, thanked her, said everything was fine. I checked on Maya and Eli, both asleep, Eli's stuffed dinosaur fallen half off the bed in the particular way it always did. I sat in the dark living room and waited for Renata to come home, and when she did, just after 11, smelling of wine and something floral that wasn't her usual perfume, I said nothing. I let her believe I'd been asleep. That night, lying next to her in the dark, I made a decision that would define the next year of my life, though I didn't fully understand its shape yet. I decided I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet, not until I understood everything, not until I had something undeniable, documented, complete. Some part of this was strategic. I knew, with the cold clarity of an engineer assessing a compromise structure, that a confrontation built on suspicion alone could be talked away, reframed, survived. A confrontation built on proof could not. But some part of it, I have to admit, was something less noble. Some part of me wanted to know everything before I said anything, because knowing everything felt like the only power I had left in a situation where I'd already lost so much without my own consent. Over the following weeks, the case I'd been quietly building accelerated. I found, in the glove compartment of Renata's car while retrieving the registration for an oil change, a hotel key card from the same Marriott, tucked into a side pocket with old parking receipts. I found, scrolling, guiltily, but by then past the point of caring, through the family laptop's browser history that she sometimes used for work emails, a search for how to know if your husband suspects. She'd cleared it afterward, but not the autofill, which still offered the ghost of the question every time I typed her email address into the search bar by accident. That detail broke something loose in me that none of the others had. Not the affair itself, not even the hotel, but the search. The evidence that she knew, on some level, that what she was doing required hiding, and that she was actively managing the risk of discovery the way you'd manage a business problem. It was the first moment the word calculated attached itself to what was happening, and once attached, it never fully came off. I learned, eventually, who Carter was, not from confronting Renata, but from the kind of quiet digging anyone can do now if they're patient and not proud about it. Carter Reyes, 44, a divorced regional director at a competing medical device company, the kind of man Renata would have met at exactly the industry conferences and quarterly meetings that had multiplied so conveniently over the past year. He had 2 teenage kids from his first marriage, lived 40 minutes outside Cedar Hollow, and according to the few public details I could piece together, had been recently promoted, a fact that, knowing what I eventually learned about Renata's fears, would turn out to matter more than I understood at the time. In early October, the financial thread I'd been pulling without fully realizing its size revealed something that changed the entire shape of what I thought I was dealing with. Going through our joint investment statements, something I did quarterly, an old habit from before any of this started, I found a withdrawal from a secondary savings account neither of us touched often, an account meant for the kids' college funds. $11,000, transferred 8 weeks earlier to an account I didn't recognize. I sat at my desk for a long time after finding that number. The affair had broken something in me that felt almost private, a wound between the two of us. Terrible, but contained. The money broke something different. It meant this wasn't only a betrayal of our marriage. It was a betrayal of our children's future, made unilaterally, in secret, by the person I trusted to make exactly these kinds of decisions with me, not around me. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever found out that the person you trusted most wasn't only lying about love, but about money too, about the part of the relationship that was supposed to be the boring, safe, unglamorous foundation underneath everything else, you understand that this is a different kind of betrayal. It doesn't just break your heart. It makes you question every joint decision you ever made, wondering which ones were real. I didn't confront her about the money either. Not yet. I opened a separate account of my own, quietly, and began redirecting a portion of my own paycheck there each month. Not stealing, not hiding anything illegal, simply protecting what remained, the way you'd shore up a foundation you already knew was compromised before the rest of the structure came down on top of it. By the time October ended, I had built, methodically and almost entirely alone, a complete picture of what was happening. The affair, 11 months in length based on the earliest hotel charge I could find, the financial withdrawal, unexplained and unauthorized, and underneath all of it, a marriage that had been quietly, unilaterally ended by my wife months before she'd ever say the words out loud to me. What I didn't have yet was understanding. I didn't know why. I didn't know what had been missing in her, in us, that had made this feel like the only available exit. That understanding would come later, delivered in her own words, in a kitchen not unlike the one where this whole story started. But by the time it arrived, I had already, quietly, and without announcing it to anyone, decided what I was going to do. By November, I had stopped thinking of myself as a husband trying to save his marriage and started thinking of myself, with the same cold precision I brought to a compromised structural assessment, as a man documenting a failure before it became catastrophic. I want to be honest about what that shift cost me. There's a version of this story where I confront Renata in October, the moment I found the missing $11,000, and we have it out. Ugly, immediate, real. I think about that version sometimes. I think it might have been kinder, to both of us, than what actually happened. But that wasn't who I was that fall. I had spent 12 years building an identity as the patient one, the steady one, and apparently even betrayal couldn't shake that identity loose overnight. I told myself I was being strategic. I was also, if I'm honest, still afraid. Afraid that confronting her meant admitting, out loud, that the life I'd built was actually gone, and once admitted, there was no path back to pretending otherwise. So I gathered instead. I hired a lawyer that month, quietly, on a Tuesday afternoon. Using a vacation day, I told my office was for a dentist appointment. Her name was Christina Dare, a family law attorney recommended by a colleague who'd gone through a difficult split 2 years earlier. Christine was unsentimental in a way I found, at the time, almost shocking, given what I was bringing into her office. "You haven't confronted her," Christine said, after I'd laid out the folder, the hotel statements, the screenshots, the missing money, across her desk. "No. Why not?" I didn't have a good answer. I said something about wanting to understand the full picture first, and Christine looked at me with the particular patience of someone who has heard every version of this sentence from every client who ever sat in that chair, and said, "Martin, there's no version of full picture that changes what you're looking at. You can keep gathering for another 6 months, and the math won't change. The only thing that changes is how much more of your own life you spend in this holding pattern." She was right, and some part of me knew she was right, and I still didn't move for another 6 weeks. I told myself I was protecting Maya and Eli from disruption during the holidays. That was true, partially. It was also, I think now, the last gasp of the man I used to be. The one who believed that if he just waited long enough, the problem might resolve itself without requiring him to do the hardest thing he'd ever done. I want to stop here for a second. Some of you already know this feeling. The one where you keep finding reasons not to look too closely, not because you're stupid, but because you're not ready. I wasn't stupid. I was a man standing at the edge of the rest of his life, trying to find one more reason to stay on the side he already knew. Christine, in that same meeting, walked me through what mattered legally, Michigan being an equitable distribution state, the relevance, or, more precisely, the limited relevance, of infidelity itself to asset division, and the much greater relevance of the missing $11,000, which, depending on how it had been used, could constitute dissipation of marital assets. "That's the thread that actually matters in court," she told me. "Not the affair. The money. Courts don't care much who someone slept with. They care a great deal about who took what, and when, and whether they can prove it. That conversation reshaped how I spent the next 2 months. I stopped trying to catch Renata in the act of betrayal. I already had more than enough proof of that, and started, with Christine's guidance, building a financial record. I pulled 12 months of statements across every account I could access. I found, eventually, that the $11,000 had been the first of 3 withdrawals, the other 2 smaller, more carefully spaced, totaling almost $19,000 across 5 months. Money that, as far as I could trace it, had gone toward hotel stays, a piece of jewelry I'd never seen Renata wear at home, and a down payment on what I'd later learn was a small apartment Carter had rented, separate from his own house, ostensibly for his consulting business. That last detail, the apartment, was the one that finally cracked something fully open in me. This wasn't a man and woman who'd made one terrible mistake and were quietly managing the fallout. This was infrastructure, a second life, built deliberately, funded in part by money meant for my children's education, maintained with the same competence Renata brought to closing a sales territory. In late November, the behavioral signs I'd been tracking for months reached what I can only describe as a near breaking point, though at the time I read it as something else entirely. Renata started having trouble sleeping. I'd wake at 2 a.m. to find her side of the bed empty, and find her downstairs at the kitchen table, phone face down beside her, staring at nothing. Once, I asked if she was okay, and she said, too quickly, "I just have a lot on my mind with work," and her hand moved, almost involuntarily, to cover the phone on the table, a gesture so small I might have missed it a year earlier. I didn't miss it now. I'd learned to read her the way I'd learned to read stress fractures in concrete, not by what was said, but by what the structure did under quiet, sustained pressure. She told me, much later, what that period had actually been. Carter got promoted to VP that fall, and everything between us changed overnight. He started talking about his future differently. Bigger house, more travel, a life that didn't have room in it for someone else's husband and kids waiting at home. He never said it outright, but I understood the shape of what he wanted, and it wasn't me. Not really. Not the actual me with a mortgage and a 9-year-old who still needed help with long division. He wanted the version of me he met at conferences. Unencumbered, exciting, available. I started to understand, somewhere in November, that I might lose both lives at once if I didn't choose one. I lay awake those nights doing math I never thought I'd have to do, trying to figure out if there was any version of this where I got to keep everything, and finding, every single time, that there wasn't. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet. I only knew that the woman across the kitchen table from me at 2 a.m. looked like someone drowning, and I still didn't ask her why, because some part of me had already decided I no longer wanted her answer to come wrapped in more lies. December brought its own particular cruelty. We hosted Christmas at our house, as we did every year. Renata's parents driving up from Ohio, my brother Russell and his family, the usual chaos of too much food and too many wrapping paper scraps, and Eli falling asleep under the tree before presents were even finished. I played the role of contented husband and father with a competence that frightened me a little, looking back. Renata did the same. We moved around each other in that kitchen with the choreography of 12 years of practice, and not one person in that house, including, I think, our own children, suspected that the marriage they were celebrating had already, functionally, ended. Looking back now, that Christmas was the moment of no return, though neither of us said so out loud. I remember standing at the sink that night, washing dishes after everyone had gone to bed, and Renata came to stand beside me, drying, in a silence that used to feel comfortable and now felt like two people standing at opposite ends of a bridge that had already started to collapse in the middle. She said, quietly, not looking at me, "We used to be good at this." "We were," I said. "What happened?" I almost told her, right there, with soap suds still on my hands. I almost said, "I know about Carter. I know about the money. I know about the apartment. Say something true to me right now, and I'll listen." I didn't say it. I said, "I don't know," which was, by that point, the only honest sentence I'd given her in 2 months, because by then, I genuinely didn't know what had happened to us, only that whatever it was, it had already happened, completely, beyond repair, while I stood quietly gathering evidence instead of fighting for what I claimed to want to save. By January, I had everything Christine said I'd need. Bank records, the hotel pattern, photographs from that night in the Marriott parking lot, the search history, the timeline of the secondary account withdrawals. What I didn't have, still, was the conversation. The actual moment of confrontation I'd been circling for 4 months like a man walking the perimeter of a building he was afraid to enter. That moment arrived on a Tuesday in late January, not because I finally found my courage, but because Renata, without knowing it, forced my hand. She came home early, 3:40 in the afternoon, hours before her usual time, and I was at the kitchen table with my laptop open to the very folder I'd spent 4 months building, the screen angled toward the window in a way I'd thought made it invisible from the doorway. It didn't. She saw it. I watched her face change as she understood, all at once, what she was looking at, and across the kitchen, in the silence between one breath and the next, for months of careful, quiet gathering collided with the conversation neither of us had been ready to have. She didn't say anything at first. She set her bag down on the counter, the same counter where this whole story began, with a charger and a phone that wasn't hers, and stood very still, looking at the laptop screen, and I watched something in her face do the math. "How long have you known?" she said finally. I closed the laptop. I'd rehearsed this moment in my head 100 times over 4 months, and in every version, I'd imagined shouting or crying or some explosion of grief finally given permission to exist out loud. What actually happened was quieter than that. I felt something in my chest go very still, the way a building goes still in the half second after the load shifts, but before anyone realizes the structure has already failed. I laid it out for her, piece by piece, methodical, without raising my voice. The hotel statements, in order. The night in the Marriott parking lot. The missing money, 11,000. Then the rest, 19,000 total. The apartment. I didn't editorialize. I just placed each fact on the table between us, the way Christine had told me to think about it, not an argument, an accounting. "Here is what I know," I said. "Here is what doesn't add up. I'd like you to explain it." Renata sat down slowly across from me, the same chair she'd sat in the night. She asked if I ever felt like I'd disappeared, and for a long moment, she said nothing at all. She wasn't crying. She wasn't performing anything. She just sat there with her hands folded in her lap, staring at a spot on the table, and the silence stretched out so long I started to wonder if she was going to answer at all. "Yes," she said finally. "It happened." She didn't elaborate. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't try to explain herself in that moment, and the absence of all that, the lack of tears, the lack of justification, felt like its own kind of confession, sharper somehow than if she'd broken down completely. Something in her had already left this marriage long before that afternoon, and sitting there, I understood she'd stopped pretending she didn't know it. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. Not then. I opened my laptop back up, calmly, and turned it so the screen faced her fully, and I said, "I want you to call him. Right now. On speaker. And end it, in front of me." She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that, looking back now, I think held something close to respect, or at least recognition, the understanding that the man across the table from her was not the man she'd assumed she could manage indefinitely. She picked up her phone. Her hands didn't shake, which surprised me. She dialed, put it on speaker, and when Carter answered, his voice bright and casual in a way that made my stomach turn, she said, flat and final, "It's over. He knows everything. Don't call me again." She hung up before he could finish saying her name. The silence after that call was the loudest thing I have ever sat inside. "How long?" I asked. My voice, when it came, was quieter than I expected, almost gentle, though I didn't feel gentle at all. She told me everything. I'm going to tell you what she said the way she said it, because I think it matters that you hear it in her words, not mine. She finally spoke. This is what she told me. It started at a conference in Columbus 14 months ago. I was tired in a way that wasn't about sleep, tired of feeling like the part of me that used to be interesting had quietly retired without telling anyone. Carter sat next to me at a dinner and asked me a question nobody had asked me in years, not about the kids, not about logistics, just, "What do you actually want, Renata, for yourself?" And I didn't have an answer, and that scared me more than anything. We talked until midnight. Nothing happened that night. I told myself the conversation was harmless, that I was allowed to feel interesting again without it meaning anything. The first time something crossed a line, I told myself it was a one-time thing, a mistake born of being tired and flattered and far from home. I told myself that surviving it quietly, without ever telling you, without ever doing it again, was the responsible choice. better than blowing up our whole life over one bad night. That was the lie I needed to keep functioning. But I didn't stop. Every time, I told myself it was the last time, and every time, some part of me chose to keep going. Because for a few hours, with him, I didn't feel like Maya's mom or your wife or the person managing everyone else's needs. I felt like myself, the version of myself I was terrified I'd lost permanently. I was so afraid of being caught, and underneath that, more afraid of losing you, and underneath even that, the thing I'm most ashamed to say out loud, afraid of finding out I'd actually disappeared. That there was no version of me left to go back to. I couldn't look at the kids' drawings on the fridge most mornings. I started leaving the kitchen before they came down for breakfast because I couldn't sit there and pretend. I tried to stop in November when he told me what he actually wanted from his future, and it wasn't me, and I realized I might lose everything at once. I didn't know how to stop, and I didn't know how to tell you. And so I just kept choosing, every single day, not to. That's what she told me. I sat across from her, listening to my wife describe the unraveling of our marriage in language that was almost clinical in its honesty, and I felt something in my chest finally crack open completely. Not from the affair itself, which I'd already absorbed in pieces over 4 months, but from the specific, devastating clarity of hearing her name the exact moment she'd chosen, again and again, to keep walking away from us instead of toward us. I didn't say much after that. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever sat across from someone you love while they hand you the precise shape of how they broke your life, you know that there's no dignified way to receive that. I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as a kind of controlled detonation, not an explosion outward, but an implosion, something collapsing inward and very quietly. I stood up. I walked to the garage. Renata didn't follow me, and I'm grateful for that now, because I needed those minutes alone more than I needed anything else. I found myself standing over my workbench, hands flat on the cool metal surface, breathing in a way that felt deliberate, counted, the way you breathe when you're trying to keep something from breaking loose entirely. I picked up nothing. I broke nothing. I just stood there until my hands stopped wanting to shake, and then I went back inside. Maya and Eli were due home from after-school care in 40 minutes. That fact, small, logistical, utterly mundane, became the only thing keeping me upright. I told Renata we'd talk more after the kids were asleep, and we moved through the rest of that evening in a strange, suspended choreography, both of us performing normalcy for 2 children who had no idea their entire world had just permanently changed shape in the kitchen hours before they walked through the door. That night, after Maya and Eli were down, Renata tried to talk again, not to confess further, but to ask, quietly, what happens now? I told her I needed time. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that I had already, somewhere in the 4 months I'd spent gathering evidence instead of confronting her, made my decision. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Not until I understood whether what remained between us was worth fighting to save, or whether I was only delaying an ending that had already arrived months ago, in a hotel parking lot in Ann Arbor, while I sat in my car and watched. I slept in the guest room that night, for the first time in 12 years. Lying there in the dark, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel yet. Underneath all the grief and anger, a strange, cold clarity. The not knowing, the thing I'd protected for so long, the door I kept telling myself I could still close, was gone now, permanently. There was no version of my life left where I could pretend not to know. And in the absence of that uncertainty, something in me had gone very quiet, very still, and very sure. We tried, for about 3 weeks in February, to see if there was anything left to save. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. I didn't walk away the night of the confrontation, however certain I felt underneath. We went to one counseling session together, sat in a small office with a therapist named Dr. Okafor who asked careful, patient questions, and I watched Renata answer them honestly, fully, without the evasion she'd used for over a year. I watched her try. It wasn't enough. Not because she didn't try hard enough, and not. I came to understand, because I didn't either, but because something in me had already closed a door that wouldn't reopen, no matter how much I wanted it to for the sake of Maya and Eli, for the sake of the life we'd built. I sat in that second counseling session and realized I was going through the motions of trying to save something I had already, somewhere in that garage in January, finished grieving. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the way I'd expected to be. I was just done, in the quiet, finished way a structure is done after the load has already shifted past the point of correction. You can shore it up temporarily, but you already know, looking at the cracks, that it's not going to hold. I told Renata in early March that I wanted a divorce. She didn't fight me on it. I think some part of her had been waiting for those words since the night in the kitchen, almost relieved to finally hear someone else make the decision she hadn't been able to make for herself. What followed was 18 months I still find difficult to describe without my jaw tightening. For court dates, 2 mediators, 1 deposition that lasted 6 hours, and a small army of paperwork that turned my marriage into a series of line items. Assets, liabilities, custody schedules, the dissipated $19,000 that became, exactly as Christine had predicted, the single most consequential fact in the entire proceeding. Infidelity barely came up in the legal arguments at all. The money did, every time. I remember sitting across from Renata's attorney during the second mediation session, watching her lay out a position so calm, so procedural, so entirely without reference to the actual human wreckage underneath it, that I finally said something out loud about how strange it was, hearing the end of my marriage discussed like a merger negotiation. Renata's lawyer looked at me, not unkindly, just with the flat practicality of someone who'd said this 1,000 times before, and told me, "I understand this feels personal to you, Mr. Holt, but at this stage, it's just business." I didn't understand what she meant by that. Not really, not for a long time. I understood the words. I didn't understand the truth underneath them until 18 months later, after the fourth court date, after the gavel, after the final decree, when I sat alone in my car in the courthouse parking lot, having walked out with primary custody of Maya and Eli, the house, and a settlement that accounted, dollar for the money taken from our children's future, and I finally understood exactly what she'd meant. Not that it didn't matter, that it mattered too much to survive being handled any other way. The only way through something that devastating, with 2 kids on the other side of it, was to treat it, deliberately, like business, because the alternative, treating it like the personal catastrophe it actually was, would have destroyed both of us long before any resolution arrived. I called this a story about silent revenge, and I think that's true, though not in the way revenge usually gets portrayed. I never raised my voice at Renata again after that night in the kitchen. I never tried to humiliate her, never weaponized the affair against her in front of the kids, never did anything except quietly, methodically, build the case that protected what mattered and let the facts speak for themselves in front of a judge who didn't care about either of our feelings, only about the math. That, I came to understand, was its own kind of justice. Not loud, not dramatic, but complete. Maya is 11 now. Eli is 8. They split time between 2 houses a mile and a half apart, and most days, that arrangement works better than I expected it to, mostly because Renata and I made a decision early on, the one good decision we made together throughout the whole 18 months, to never let our daughter or son carry the weight of what happened between us. I see Renata at school pickups sometimes. We're polite. We're not friends, but we're not enemies either, just 2 people who built something together for 12 years and then, through a combination of her choices and my own long silence, watched it come apart. I think about my own part in this often, more than people probably expect. I wasn't the one who had the affair. I wasn't the one who took the money. But I was the one who noticed the cracks for months. The second phone, the name at the dinner table, the hotel statement, the locked phone, the missing money, and chose, again and again, comfort over confrontation. I called it patience. It was avoidance wearing patience's clothes, and it cost me months I can't get back. Months where I might have asked the harder questions sooner and found a different outcome, or at least arrived at the same outcome with less collected damage along the way. That's the lesson I carry hardest from all of this. Silence doesn't protect a marriage. It just delays the moment you find out whether there was anything left to protect. I think, too, about Renata's confession in that kitchen, about disappearing, about needing to feel interesting again, about the fear underneath the betrayal that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with who she was afraid of becoming. I don't excuse what she did. The choice to keep walking toward Carter again and again for 14 months was hers alone, made freely, made repeatedly. But I understand it now in a way I couldn't in that kitchen, not as an excuse, but as an explanation. People don't usually destroy what they love because they stopped loving it. They destroy it because they got lost somewhere along the way and couldn't find the door back home. And instead of asking for help finding it, they went looking for a different door entirely. I don't know if I'll ever fully trust again the way I trusted before all this happened. I think that particular kind of trust, the unguarded, unthinking kind, the kind that lets you reach into your wife's bag for a charger without a second thought, might be gone for good. But I've found something else in its place, something steadier, maybe, a trust in my own judgment, in my ability to notice what's true and eventually act on it, even when acting costs everything I thought I wanted to keep. Last week, Eli asked me, out of nowhere, while we were building a Lego set on the living room floor, why Mom and I don't live together anymore. I gave him the version we'd practiced, that sometimes grown-ups love their kids completely and still can't make a marriage work, and that none of it was his fault or Maya's. He nodded, considered it with the particular seriousness 8-year-olds bring to questions they don't fully understand yet, and said, okay, but you still love us the same amount, right? Like, the exact same amount as before. The exact same amount, I told him. That part never changed. He went back to his Legos, satisfied, and I sat there for a moment longer than I needed to, looking at my son's bent head and feeling something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for almost 2 years. Not happiness, not yet, not exactly. Something quieter than that, something closer to peace. The most painful detail in this story isn't the affair, and it isn't even the missing money. It's the 8-week window in early spring when Martin first noticed the signs and chose, deliberately, not to look closer. That choice, repeated dozens of times over the following year, did almost as much damage to his sense of self as Renata's betrayal eventually did to their marriage. There's a quiet tragedy in watching a careful, competent man apply none of his professional rigor to the one structure that mattered most to him personally, until the cracks had already spread too far to repair. What this story ultimately reveals is a chain reaction built on 2 separate forms of avoidance operating in parallel. Renata avoided confronting her own fear of irrelevance by seeking it resolved outside the marriage rather than within it, choosing escalation over honesty at every fork in the road. Martin avoided confronting the growing evidence of that choice by converting vigilance into procrastination, mistaking the gathering of proof for productive action when it was, for months, simply another form of hiding. Neither avoidance excuses the other. Renata's choices were hers alone, made with full agency, repeated long after she understood their cost. But together, they explain how a 12-year marriage with 2 children and genuine history could unravel so completely before either party said a single true word to the other. The accumulation effect here is worth sitting with. No single missed signal destroyed this marriage. Not the second phone, not the locked screen, not even the first hotel charge. It was the compounding weight of dozens of small, individually deniable moments, each one survivable alone, that together became impossible to outrun. By the time Martin finally confronted Renata, the conversation wasn't a beginning. It was an ending that had already happened in 100 smaller moments, finally being acknowledged out loud. What changed the outcome, in the end, wasn't emotion, it was structure. Christine's advice to treat the proceedings as a documented financial case rather than an emotional referendum on betrayal gave Martin something his grief alone never could have: clarity, and a path forward that didn't depend on Renata's cooperation, honesty, or remorse. That single piece of practical guidance reframed 18 months of devastation into something survivable, line by line, court date by court date. If there's a question this story leaves without an answer, it's this: how many marriages quietly end months, sometimes years, before either person says so out loud? And how much of that silence is mercy? And how much of it is simply fear wearing mercy's clothes? I think about the people sitting across kitchen tables right now, holding a small, deniable piece of evidence in their hands, telling themselves it's nothing. I was that person once. I understand, completely, why you'd rather not know yet. I just hope you find your way to the question sooner than I did.